appear on shows like Monster Quest, Ancient Aliens, Legend Hunters, and Unexplained Files. He's been on Animal Planet, Sci-Fi Channel, National Geographic, and Discovery Science. You might have seen his History Channel series Missing in Alaska. He travels the world in search of evidence of Bigfoot, Chupacabra, Loch Ness Monster, Mothman, Thunderbirds, and even werewolves. How about a big hand for Mr. Ken Gerhard?
Thank you. Thank you all for showing up for a wonderful, another wonderful Texas Bigfoot Conference. I've been doing these for many years, and it's definitely one of the best events around, no doubt about it. And it's because of you people, so thank you, thank you. I'm going to begin my presentation today as all cryptozoological inquiry should begin, and that's with science. But I'm going to be talking about something that may or may not be related to Bigfoot, but it's definitely within the paradigm of the phenomenon, and it's something that's been going on for a long time. And as I've had the opportunity to travel around the world, I continually collect accounts of these little furry guys. So again, let's begin with the science. So most of you are familiar with the so-called hobbit, Homo floresiensis, the Flores man. In 2003, an archaeological team that was excavating in a place called Liangbua Cave on the Indonesian isle of Flores unearthed the remains of a diminutive hominid standing about 3 feet tall, and it displayed characteristics. Its characteristics displayed like a mosaic of both primitive and derived traits. So it's a very controversial find at first. And after 14 years of intensive study by experts around the world in a number of fields, it is now, the common opinion is that it is not a pathological Homo sapiens. It is not a small, pygmy-sized Homo sapiens. It is not a pygmy or dwarfed Homo erectus, but it is something that appears to be a sister species to Homo habilis, which is a tiny hominid that evolved in Africa 2 million years ago and is actually the first species that's recognized in our genus Homo. Coincidentally, in 2015, a study that was conducted or led by Professor Mark Collett of Canada's William Fraser University determined that it was actually Homo habilis, not Homo erectus, as previously thought, that radiated out of Africa starting 2 million years ago and spread out all over the world. And there have been other finds in recent years that are just as fascinating. Now, when Homo floresiensis was first discovered, it was estimated that its remains were only about 12 or 13 to 18,000 years ago, literally yesterday in terms of the scope of human evolution. Recent radiocarbon dating that's been a little bit more precise puts the dating at about 50,000 years ago, which was about the time that Homo sapiens began to migrate across Asia and down into Indonesia and so forth. Other recent findings that are interesting are a hominid that was discovered in Africa, a rising star cave back in 2013, known as Homo naledi, that was also a very primitive, very small hominid, and it was only around 250,000 years ago. And then you have other finds like the Dmanisi hominids in Georgia and so forth. So basically what I'm saying here is it is now accepted that beginning 2 million years ago, tiny little, presumably hair-covered subhumans or man-like creatures began moving out of Africa all over the world. So isn't it interesting that as you travel all over the world, in virtually every culture around the globe, you hear stories about little people that live deep in the wilderness that are often covered in hair. And this is a good, you can see the size and scale there. There's a Homo floresiensis skull on the right-hand side next to Homo sapiens. So you can see how small these little people or little creatures were. So the term proto-pygmies was first coined by the very influential, one of the founding fathers of cryptozoology, Ivan Terence Sanderson, who wrote the iconic book, Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life. And as Ivan did essentially a global census of what he called ABSMs, which stood for Abominable Snowman, an abbreviation, around the world, he developed a taxonomic system, if you will, where he established that there were at least 4, maybe 5 different types of things that were being kind of grouped together as abominable snowman. The neo-giants, which are things like Bigfoot or Sasquatch, subhumans, and so forth. And one of his classifications was proto-pygmies. And there were many examples of this that he wrote about in his book, and also Bernard Heuvelmans, the other founding father of cryptozoology, also wrote about these. The most famous one, of course, is probably the orang pendek, or Sadapa, or Gugu of Sumatra. Also in Asia, we have the Nitevo of Ceylon or Sri Lanka. And there are many, many examples. I could literally stand here for 30 minutes and run down a list of different names for proto-pygmy type beings around the world. In Africa, you have the Agagwe and Sahite, Tokolosh. Here in the Americas, primarily in Latin America, Simon Sanderson wrote about the Shiru, the Didi, and in Belize, the Duende. So, basically the commonality here was small, bipedal, hair-covered, man-like beings or creatures that stood on average, between 3 to maybe 5 feet tall, kind of a gracile, slender build, unlike the Sasquatch. And so one thing we should probably do is dispel the notion. I'm sure some of you out there are probably thinking, well, could some of these reports be attributed to juvenile Sasquatches? They're not born Bigfoot, right? They have to grow up just like everything else in nature. That could most certainly be the case in some situations. But oftentimes these things have been reported in pairs, walking together in pairs, in groups. They're reported with such frequency that it's hard to accept, excuse me, hard for me to accept that these could be juvenile Sasquatches in all cases. Excuse me, a little hoarse today. So, my own personal experience investigating proto-pygmies began in 2004 when I mounted an expedition down to the Central American nation of Belize, formerly British Honduras, to search for evidence of 2 types of mystery hominids. One was similar to the Sasquatch, and it was called the Sisamite. The descriptions are very similar to Bigfoot, 7 feet tall, hairy, muscular, powerful, and so forth. Lives high in the mountains. People are very terrified. But there was a second form that Ivan Sanderson had written about called the Duende. And Duende is a derivative word, it's Spanish for goblin. Now, like most little people reports around the world, there are whimsical aspects to the Duende. People in Belize often depict the Duende as a little man with a long beard, wearing a hat, carrying a machete. He's only got 4 fingers and his feet point backwards, so that certainly doesn't sound like a hominid, but something more like the European little man reports of, or stories of leprechauns and gnomes and things like that. But when Ivan Sanderson was living in Central America during World War II, he actually spoke to forestry rangers who worked in the forests of Belize, who convinced him that there were actually small hair-covered beings living deep in the woods and the jungle and so forth. Excuse me, I should have brought some water up here. So the descriptions of the Duende, oh, thank you, my savior. The descriptions of the Duende, according to Sanderson, and these junior forestry rangers, was that they stood about 3.5 to 4.5 feet tall, that their bodies were covered in short brown fur, kind of like a dog's fur, and that they had flat, yellowish faces, very ancient-looking faces. And these little beings were often seen on the edges of the jungles and forests of Belize. If you people don't know anything about Belize, it's a pretty cool little country. It has the lowest population in Central America, only about 200, 300,000 people. And most of those people live on the coast. So once you get into the interior, it's all mountains and jungles and pretty diverse habitat. This happened to me one night. I was on Coast to Coast AM with George Nuri, and I began coughing in front of 4 million people. That was pretty embarrassing. Here I am investigating a flattened area in the Maya Mountains of Belize, where some of these duendes have been reported. So I spoke to some of the local people about the duende, and I heard some whimsical interpretations of these creatures, that they had magical powers, that they would abduct children and things like that. The only evidence I found was we did find some small, sort of human-like tracks. Didn't really have a lot of definition as far as toes and stuff, but we found those in a pretty remote area where humans don't go. So that was a little bit interesting at the time. I mounted a second expedition to Belize down in 2006 and didn't find any evidence at that time. But you know, just one example of a proto-pygmy that's been reported from the New World. Now, in 2010, I think it was 2012, I was speaking at an event in northern Minnesota. And after my lecture, I was approached by a family, a Chippewa family, who lived on a reservation in North Dakota. And they told me that their reservation was being terrorized by little hairy creatures like this. They called them the Memogesi. And they said that they were basically a complete nuisance, that they were stealing livestock, or killing livestock, small animals, killing their dogs, stealing their food supplies, and so forth. So these people were literally terrified. I mean, they were describing something to me that sounded like the duende, sounded like a proto-pygmy, but I was stunned. And we're talking about North Dakota. So I mean, this is North America, right? Could there be creatures like this in North America? Well, lo and behold, there are legends and stories and reports from all over North America. Virtually every indigenous tribe has a tradition or culture that includes little people, often described as little hair-covered men. For example, in Montana's Little Pryor Mountains, which is in kind of southwest Montana, there's something known as the Narumbi or Awakule, the little hairy ones that live in the Little Pryor Mountains, according to the Crow people that live in that area. Sorry guys, I'm really dry today. Must be that good Jefferson air. I'm used to San Antonio where we have all the allergies and stuff. The Narumbi or Awakule were described as being about 3 or 4 feet tall, very powerful, small and well proportioned, but very powerful, and that they were greatly, greatly feared by the Crow people in that area. In fact, they would specifically avoid going to the Little Pryor Mountains because they didn't want to run across these very aggressive and potentially cannibalistic little people that had been there for long before the natives moved into the area. And in fact, there were some alleged petroglyphs in the mountains that the little people had made as well. Now, when I was up in Alaska in 2015 filming the TV show, we actually did an episode, and guys, please understand, when you're working in television, I think Cliff referenced this yesterday, you know, you do what you can with what you got. So you're constantly negotiating with TV producers and stuff, but they actually wanted to title the episode Gnomes, the Ice Gnomes, so that's what we went with. They're not actually called gnomes up there. But there are many little people traditions, proto-pygmy traditions throughout Alaska, where they're referred to as the Imanoroks, Anukans, Jinxie Hawk, Ixchee Hawk. There's a lot of different native names for them. Many of the reports stem from Southwest Alaska. And we actually interviewed this eyewitness, a woman named Sarah, who claimed that these little hairy creatures were living in caves near their property, and that they would come out and crawl into the house and harass their dogs, and she was afraid that her children were going to be abducted and so forth. So people in Alaska are actually more terrified of the little people than they are of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, believe it or not. Lots of Bigfoot or Sasquatch stories from Alaska as well, but it's the little people that really seem to terrify people up there. And there are many of the native people, and you have a number of tribes up there. You have the Inuit, the Yupik, the Athabascans, the Tlingit. They all have little people stories, and they're all very terrified of the little people. We call them people, but we don't know exactly what they are, but they're very human-like. And that, they're there, essentially. That, there's no denying there's something to the stories. And this summer I was up in Oregon, and in Oregon they actually have proto-pygmy reports of something known as the pahoho claw, or in some cultures they also call it the joga or gogane. But while I was up in Oregon, I met a gentleman named Thomas Seward, who is Kwak-Yodel from British Columbia, coastal British Columbia. And he travels around to different Bigfoot events and does tribal dances from his culture. And Thomas was telling me that there's something in the field of cryptozoology that we have to dispel. Essentially, they have something in their culture known as a bukwas. And he said in a lot of cryptozoological literature and a lot of shows, people interpret the bukwas as being a Sasquatch. But according to Thomas, a bukwas is not a Sasquatch. A bukwas is a pygmy-sized, hair-covered creature, man-like creature, that can be seen only at night as it forages on the beaches for mussel, clam shells, and things like that. And that they are greatly feared by his people, and that you definitely don't want to encounter them. And you should absolutely not accept food from a bukwas because it will be poisoned and so forth. In his culture, the Sasquatch is actually called the Zunaqua. So you've heard of the wild one of the woods. The Zunaqua is a Sasquatch. Bukwas is the little man, the little hairy man that lives on the beach. So yet another example of a Native American tradition that talks about these little people. Now, this is where it gets interesting for me, and probably for you too. About a year ago, I interviewed a gentleman from Southwest Ohio named Jake Dressel. I interviewed both he and his wife at length, and according to them both, they saw what they described as a small hairy troll walking across their property on 2 different occasions. So we're talking about Southwest Ohio, guys. It's not a real developed area, but kind of out on the edge of the wilderness. According to Jake, one morning about 4:30 in the morning, he was taking his dog out early in the morning for a walk, and still kind of dark, and his dog fixated on something that was kind of hiding behind a tree in an adjacent property. And at some point the dog began barking, and he said this thing moved out from behind the tree, and he said it was about 2 to 3 feet tall, clearly walking on its hind legs and hobbling back and forth, kind of like a little person does, and it was completely covered in hair, and the only thing that he could equate this to was some kind of troll or something like that. Well, for obvious reasons, he was hesitant to tell his girlfriend or his wife about the experience, until the following morning. It was her turn to take the dog out at 4:30, and she came back inside and said that she had just seen something small and hairy on 2 legs walk in front of the neighbor's house across the street. So, there you have an account of a modern, little, hairy, 2-legged something. And again, I guess you could speculate, maybe it's a juvenile Sasquatch. If it were that small, 2 to 3 feet tall, you would wonder where the mother was or the parent was, because I don't think juvenile Sasquatches probably aren't precocial. Most primates are very social and very nurturing, so you're going to have a situation where if you see a small juvenile Sasquatch, you would assume that the mother or the parents are nearby and so forth. But there you go, there's a modern account of a quote-unquote Littlefoot. So what are these things if they're out there? You know, could there in fact be a diminutive form of a Sasquatch or something like a Sasquatch running around out there on two legs, small and hairy? Well, again, you have the legends all over the world, different cultures. And you have a pretty convincing case from the fossil history when you look at things like Homo floresiensis and some of these other diminutive hominids. I'm trying to think if I forgot anything. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes? Okay. Do I have any questions from the audience, or does anyone have anything they'd like to add to the Little People mystery? No? Okay, well maybe yes, sir.
There was a video that came out a little while back that seemed to be a group of people who captured something small, like what you're describing, and it was running around inside their house or whatever this place was. And some people think that it could have just been a monkey with a fur suit on. Have you seen or have any kind of opinion about that?
Yeah, I remember the video you're talking about. It was like supposedly an Asian little person, wild man. Yeah, it looked like a monkey that had been put up in a costume or something. Its head was shaved. And I'm personally pretty skeptical about photographic evidence, particularly in this day and age with YouTube and Photoshop and all that kind of stuff. So we always have to be on guard about those kinds of things. Yes?
Do they come in different colors?
Excuse me, that's a great point. They're usually reported as being a reddish color, like a kind of like a reddish cinnamon or burgundy type color, which is interesting again. If you look at Little People legends around the world, aren't they often described as having red hair? I mean, I could be wrong about that, but it seems like a prevalent thing.
Well, I had a niece that described, she was 5 years old, and she described it as a little yellow naked man running across her yard.
Okay, but was it hair covered or no? It was just yellow.
She didn't say. She just said it was yellow. I assume maybe a light tan.
Okay, well thank you for sharing that, but red is primarily the color, but they've often been described as being brown as well. Yes?
Have they ever been reported making vocal sounds?
I'm not aware of anyone, well actually, you know, let me backtrack, that's a great question. In Belize, the duende is reported as making a sound like a baby crying. Is that creepy or what? It's interesting that, you know, we're talking about, when we talk about Sasquatch, we're talking about something that is very physically imposing, 7 feet, 8 feet tall, hundreds of pounds. I mean, a giant, a monster. But as you travel the world and talk to people, whenever it comes to something like the duende or the proto-pygmy that's a little tiny, it seems like that's even more terrifying to us for whatever reason. There's an interesting psychological component. I'd like to, I'm glad you brought that up about the vocalization, because I'd like to do kind of like a brief synopsis of the characteristics that are commonly reported on all proto-pygmy cases around the world. They're always described as being mischievous or kind of malevolent. So, you know, again, there are whimsical interpretations in different cultures that they're magic and that they can do all these things. But it seems like the underlying theme is really that they are basically scavengers, that they are constantly kind of hanging around on the fringes of human civilization, and that they're stealing our food. Abducting children is a commonly held belief. The last thing is that they're always described as living in caves or living in holes in the ground. And that could be an adaptation to avoid contact with us. All right, guys, I'm going to wrap it up. But I appreciate you coming out. I'll be at my table if anyone wants to come up and talk about the Proto-pygmies, Little People. Thank you.
And Gerhard, and bottled water. Thank you so much.